will be muted during the presentation to minimize distractions. You will have the opportunity to unmute for Q&A after the presentation. If you experience any technical issues, please use the chat function and our team will do their best to assist you. Today, we're here to explore how trees can transform cities into cooler and cleaner places to live. We have an engaging session lined up with an insightful discussion from our expert panelists from Groundwork USA. With us, we have Meg Morgan, Senior Manager of Urban Forestry Programs, and we also have Jeremy Hoffman, Director of Impact Evaluation and Community Science. To help guide today's conversation, we have our Climate Resilience Manager, Harrison Nesbitt, as our moderator. With that, I'll turn it over to Harrison to get us started.
Thanks, Jerome, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So I just want to briefly talk about who we are at Groundwork Hudson Valley. Next slide, please. Groundwork Hudson Valley is an environmental nonprofit based in Yonkers, New York, and our organization has three program areas. First is sustainability education, which offers STEM curriculum to Yonkers public schools and operates the Science Barge, pictured on your left. It's a floating, living laboratory on the Hudson River that is completely off the grid and open to the public from the summer through the fall. We also have our youth programs, or the Green Team. This is a group of 30 high school students from Yonkers public schools that learn leadership skills through paid, hands-on environmental work, planting trees, removing invasives, and tabling at community events. And then finally, we have our Climate Resilience Program, which promotes nature-based solutions for adapting to warmer, wetter weather through geospatial analysis, reports, and demonstration projects. We also lead an air quality monitoring program and host 4 resident working groups, which we'll get to later on. We also coordinate the Sawmill River Coalition. So we want to make this engaging for everyone, so please share your thoughts in the chat throughout, and we're going to keep track of your questions. But we'll start off by asking, please enter into the chat where you're based and what you hope to learn in this webinar, so that we can make sure that it's that you're getting something out of it that you're keen to. No one is typing in yet, so I'll start. That I'm sitting in an office in Yonkers. It's really pretty outside, and I'm really excited to learn a little bit more about how data collection can help us in determining where to plant our trees. Cincinnati, Florida, very exciting. And if anyone wants to chat, type in anything what they're most interested about learning about, that would be excellent as well. Hello, Brooklyn. Oh, excellent. Hey, Judy, how's it going? Okay, perfect. I think to keep things going, y'all are going to have more questions after we get to these great presenters, but I'll say, next slide, I'm going to introduce our first of 2 guests, Jeremy Hoffman, who is the Director of Impact Evaluation and Community Science at Groundwork USA. Jeremy establishes science-based metrics for climate and workforce development programs, and he previously served as the chief scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia. He also serves as the Southeast chapter lead for the 5th National Climate Assessment and was named a fellow of this organization in 2021. He holds a PhD from Oregon State. So we're going to kick it over to you, Jeremy.
Thanks so much, Harrison. Good afternoon, evening for those based in London, I guess, or almost early evening. Thanks again for the invitation to come and speak about a little bit about the science of mapping urban heat and understanding how those sorts of data can help us actually prioritize particular places for tree planting projects. So again, my name is Jeremy Hoffman. I'm really thrilled to be here as the Director of Impact Evaluation and Community Science at Groundwork USA. And I'll be kicking off the talk today, and then passing it over to my colleague Meg, who will talk more about our urban forestry trends. And so just to get immediately into it, mapping urban temperatures. We basically have three general ways that we understand how temperatures vary across time and space. At the broadest scale, and at the kind of planetary scale, we have to rely on things like space-based satellites that are operated by groups like NASA and the USGS, that actually take pictures of the ground surface with really sophisticated cameras that can actually see heat. Now, we can use these same sorts of cameras at different scales, from a handheld camera that you can attach to your phone to those that you can put on a drone to see kind of at the scale of a city and neighborhood, which we'll share a little bit more about in the later part of my part of the talk. And these kind of space-based satellites, which I love to compare the kind of way, the level of detail for each of those things, like to other forms of scientific observation. If a handheld FLIR camera or the infrared camera on your phone is like a microscope, then the drone is like a magnifying glass. And the satellites, because they're up in space, is kind of like, if I use corrective lenses, I wear glasses. If I take them off and I look at my screen, I can see Harrison, the outline of Harrison, but I can't see any sorts of like really detailed pieces of Harrison's face. And so if you wear glasses, this is the kind of resolution that we get of the Earth's surface. You can see major kinds of trends and patterns on the Earth's surface, but we need to use more detailed descriptions of heat to better understand how it varies across our scales of interest, like a neighborhood. Now, when we get out of kind of those cameras that can see heat, we can actually sense heat using thermometers as well. So these are mostly, people tend to think of the ground-based weather stations that the groups at NOAA, like the National Weather Service, use to report on temperature trends over long periods of time. Now, what's hard about these is that they tend to be placed outside of urban centers. They have a very strict criteria for how and when they can be placed in a particular area. And because they're just located in one place for a long period of time, that can give us a level of detail understanding the temperature trends at that one place. But we know that temperatures vary a lot more in the course of just a walk through our neighborhoods. And that's why we then further kind of get down a level of detail. And something that I've been involved with since 2017 has been mobile participatory community science campaigns, where we put thermometers on vehicles like bikes and on cars, and we drive them around and ride them around in our neighborhoods during extreme heat events to actually physically map out air temperatures at different times of the day. Now, you can still access information about these campaigns through the heat.gov website, at least for the time being. But this has largely been supported by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, and supported by a group called CAPA, or the CAPA Heat Watch group. If you're interested, you can kind of look those programs up. In over 70 communities nationwide and several communities internationally have now used this same kind of strategy for understanding extreme heat in their cities. In fact, one of those cities is Yonkers. And back in August of 2019, several volunteers recruited by Groundwork Hudson Valley collected over 30,000 data points of how temperature varies across space and time in the city of Yonkers. Now, I'm showing here the three maps of where those vehicles went around in Yonkers. And the left is 6 a.m., so very early in the morning, 3 p.m. in the afternoon. That's the hottest part of the day and the time of the day where most people who work outside or have other needs to get around in non-air conditioned spaces. This is the heaviest time of the day for heat-related illness. burdens. And then 7 p.m., this is when people who live in houses with inadequate ventilation or air conditioning then have to, spend the rest of their evening trying to cool down through other means. So what's interesting about these patterns, and those of you that live in Yonkers or have been to Yonkers will recognize some of these landscapes, but largely the kinds of patterns and trends we see in the data in Yonkers are the same that we see everywhere. Places that are largely paved over with very little green space tend to amplify temperatures by several degrees in relation to other places that have more green space in them. So just looking at these satellite images, you can see places that look more built up tend to be warmer than the places that are close by to more green-like spaces. Now, in this case, in Yonkers, there was a 15-degree Fahrenheit difference between the coolest and warmest place at the exact same time at 3 p.m. So that's 15 degrees at that time was from 80 degrees Fahrenheit to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So 2 people walking around in the city of Yonkers at 3 p.m. on August 4th, 2019, felt as much as a 15-degree Fahrenheit difference. And that's just within where we were able to observe those temperatures. In fact, it could be much greater in places that vehicles are unable to access directly. Now, what's really interesting is that then those data can be used to help us understand how existing heat interventions are inadequate to fully protect everyone during extreme heat waves. So in this case, a follow-up partnership with NASA, their DEVELOP program in 2021, published a whole bunch of really interesting information about how heat disproportionately impacts particular neighborhoods in Yonkers and around Yonkers, as well as how those neighborhoods are related to existing heat interventions like cooling centers. So in this map, we have places that have very high heat exposure index values, meaning that they experience higher levels of extreme heat. In red, in relation to walking networks. So this is kind of a buffer system of how far away are people on foot from these cooling centers. Now, this is from 2021. It could be different now. New community centers, new, kind of like vernacular community centers, places where people naturally gather in their communities, places of worship and so on. But at this level, it's very clear that several of these high exposure index, heat exposure index neighborhoods fall well outside of what would be a useful walk to a cooling center. And this means that we need to do other sorts of interventions, and those that our groundwork network tend to do in other places that have high heat exposure index values. And so in this case, I want to share some really new information collected over last summer. We actually hired some drone operators to go out and use their thermal cameras on their drones to actually physically map some of the project areas for Groundwork Hudson Valley. In this case, we're looking at an aerial image on the left of the 93 Bruce Avenue public housing complex, and 93 Bruce Avenue. I guess I'll reveal which particular one that is in just a second. But on the right, we see the actual surface temperatures as described from blue being the coolest surface temperatures to red being the warmest surface temperatures. And so 80 degrees in this case are Celsius times 2 plus 30 is almost 190 degrees Fahrenheit to the touch. And so if we look at some of those features that produce those higher temperatures, darker roofs and dark asphalt surfaces and dark cars tend to be those higher surface temperatures. Meanwhile, infrastructure like trees, big mature trees here, produce temperatures much reduced from that by as much as 60 degrees Celsius, which is almost over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And also I want to draw your attention now to 93 Bruce Avenue is the white roof here that was actually installed by Groundwork Hudson Valley. And that produces some of the coolest surface temperatures of buildings in this entire study area. So that's really great news. And actually some follow-up work that we did using upper level apartment energy data show that these folks living at the topmost parts of this building actually saw about a 10 to 15% reduction in their energy use during the summer, largely due to this installation of this cool roof. So very exciting. Also, one more thing I want to draw your attention to is building shade, actually structural shade. So the tall buildings cast shadows on these dark surfaces like roads, especially where the roads are very narrow. If you have a building that's taller than the road is wide, placed in the way of the sun's incoming energy, you can create very low surface temperatures on even dark surfaces by just providing shade. And so one of the really cool things that this NASA developed partnership did as well was to model what new shade produced by trees would do to temperatures in two neighborhoods. Oh, I actually replaced the wrong neighborhood name here. It's the Kimball neighborhood and Nodine Hill neighborhood that was renamed from the old 7th Ward. So I apologize that I messed up the renaming here. But just to give an idea of what these computer models can do, is they can calculate what the difference in temperature felt by a person walking in these places would feel from the existing conditions in Kimball neighborhood on the left to planting even something like 30 or so trees. And by looking at the differences in temperatures, this ends up being about 5 degrees Fahrenheit in perceived temperature. And that's a huge change in the comfort level for some of these places in particular, like 8 degrees here in the green area along this very non-shaded street. And you can see some places that see lesser reductions in temperature based onto the greenness around them. So we can actually use these data to then inform where we then place these trees to achieve the maximum benefit for people that are walking around. And in this case, in the Nodine Hill neighborhood, on the left, we have the existing condition and then planted trees on the right, and the same kind of thing, but a much bigger difference in this more built up zone. Bigger temperature reductions, almost 8 degrees Fahrenheit on average, with some of those places seeing, as much as 9, 10 degree Fahrenheit differences between one and another. And this can be the difference between someone experiencing and really succumbing to a heat-related illness versus not. So I encourage you to take a look at this story map also if you haven't in a while. It's really great way for us to inform the sorts of projects that we do using generations of data over the course of many years. Finally, I want to kind of wrap up here with some exciting results from other places in the Groundwork network. In this case, Elizabeth, New Jersey, just over the river in Elizabeth, where Groundwork Elizabeth has been planting microforests over the last few years. And in this case, they're closely related to Miyawaki forests, basically highly dense plantings, several hundreds of trees going in a very small area to maximize that environmental benefit through promoting competition between those living organisms. In this case, we also did the drone imagery here, showing that this microforest cools surface temperatures by 40 degrees in relation to the parking lot, those dark, hard surfaces, and 10 degrees Fahrenheit relative to open grass surfaces. And it's as efficient as the big mature trees nearby. So these microforests, only a few years old, are as good of an intervention as some things that are 30 years old. And by calculating actually its benefits over time, compared to the initial investment and annual costs, this microforest gives us back $3.35 for every dollar we spend on it. So I'm looking forward to seeing how Groundwork Hudson Valley's microforests mature over time and produce probably equally, if not better, results as well. So wrapping it up really fast, thanks so much for your attention. But just to highlight here, we can use scientific tools to measure heat in our communities. We can then use those data to actually measure how our interventions are reducing heat and protecting our residents. And Groundwork trusts across our network are turning down the temperature in their neighborhoods by using science. So thank you so much. I'll turn it back over to you, Harrison, to introduce my colleague, Meg.
Thanks, Jeremy. That was awesome. My notebook is filled with chicken scratch questions, so I'm curious to hear what everyone else has to think. But before that, we're gonna have a quick poll. I'm curious to know from the audience which strategy mentioned by Jeremy do you think would have the greatest impact in your community? So I think the poll is going to come up, but some of the things that Jeremy discussed were mapping heat using drones, implementing cool roofs or painting, that white reflective paint over roofs, or just increasing the tree canopy. You could also type in some other questions if you have them. Maybe the microforest. I don't know if microforest is tree canopy or other. It's a little bit of both.
It's a little bit of everything there, Harrison.
So this is cool. So we're getting, it's a real horse race, but I gotta say, increasing tree canopy is really pulling ahead. Does it have it? Does cool roofs have a chance? No, it's tree canopy. It's tree canopy. That was exhilarating. So
Yeah,
thank you, audience.
That is great.
Wow. Yeah. Final results, 79% tree canopy, 47%. We want to say it's a close second, but I can't give cool roofs that credit. A distant second place, but a second place nonetheless. You still get a silver. I'm excited now to introduce our next great presenter, Meg Morgan. Meg is the Senior Manager of Urban Forestry Programs at Groundwork USA. She supports stewardship and community-led urban forestry initiatives, and has an expertise in nonprofit management. Meg also led a tree planting campaign that quadrupled equity outcomes in 5 years. Meg holds a master's in leadership and public service from Lipscomb University and an urban forestry certificate from Oregon State. So over to you, Meg. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and so happy to be here with you all. As Harrison said, my name is Meg, and at Groundwork USA, I have the very cool job of working really closely with the affiliates in our network on their urban forestry projects. So for the next kind of few minutes here, I am going to kind of talk about how we approach urban forestry within the network, kind of talk a little bit about the Groundwork way. So we'll zoom in a little bit to the Groundwork network. We'll zoom out a little bit to talk a little bit about the field of urban forestry in general too. What are some of the opportunities? What are some of the barriers to planting and maintaining trees in neighborhoods that need it the most? And of course, we'll talk some about the perfect tree for your city too. We're going to kind of leave that as a little bit of a cliffhanger for the end here too, since that was the title of our presentation. We will get to that. So how do we approach urban forestry within the Groundwork network? We are data-driven and we are people-centered. So you heard a lot from Jeremy already about this data-driven approach and kind of deciding like where trees can have the most benefit. But we're also planting trees and maintaining them in a way that is very much people-centered. So we are focused on bringing those benefits of public health and environmental health to people, right? Of course, we're planting trees for combating extreme heat, and for all these other reasons and benefits that trees bring as well, like our mental health, environmental health, things like mitigating stormwater, filtering our air, keeping our soil healthy, providing habitat for wildlife. So all of these benefits, for people and for the environment as well, which you can't really pull apart. So we're doing all of that related to trees, right? But we are also planting and maintaining trees because of the impact that this will have on neighborhood cohesion, on community connectedness. Folks are more likely to go outside and talk to one another when there are trees outside, spend time out there, and building community advocates for this work. So we're very much doing it for the trees, but also kind of for the people. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the examples of types of work that's going on across the network to kind of outline this approach and how we do things within Groundwork. So this here is a picture of some of the staff and a community member in one of our affiliates, which is Groundwork San Diego. And they really highlight how Groundwork approaches things from a partnership perspective and really leans into working with coalitions, working with other organizations, as well as community members. So San Diego is doing this by working really closely with community members to help lead the outreach for trees and to help conduct some of that maintenance as well. So we also approach urban forestry through a kind of people-centered lens through some of our data work too. So again, you can't really like pull these things apart. But this is, of course, a snapshot from our friends at Groundwork Hudson Valley. And this is an example of the inventorying work that is going on. So figuring out what do we actually have, what trees already exist, what is the quality of our urban canopy, so that we can then make really informed decisions about where do we want to plant trees that they will have the most impact. And of course, the other benefits here too, kind of leaning into that people-centered side of things, is that while you're also doing this and gathering this really important and information that will affect future decisions, you're also forming relationships with people in the community that maybe you didn't have before, spending some time actually physically being there, acknowledging the tree, kind of a mindfulness meditation moment. I've heard the folks at Groundwork Hudson Valley discuss, and that brings all other kinds of benefits as well. This is Jethro. He is a tree ambassador at Groundwork Ohio River Valley in the Cincinnati, Kentucky area. He is trained and is performing tree maintenance on trees that are planted in his own neighborhood. So he's kind of working on this maintenance in kind of a neighbor to neighbor way, and is trained up and being paid to do this work and advocating for the trees in his own neighborhood, kind of that neighbor to neighbor kind of community-based approach. This program is something that many trusts across the network are working on, developing this community stewardship. This is one example. Jerome is pretty awesome. Jerome, I meant to say Jethro, sorry. I was looking at you there, Jerome. Hey, Jerome, you could be a tree ambassador too. We'll get there at the end. So other angles of these trust projects that we're focusing on in the network are workforce development projects. So this is not only getting trees planted and maintaining them where they're needed, but also providing the training for folks to have these really high quality and much needed jobs after these training programs have ended. So all of these are kind of examples of how we approach things through that data-driven and people-centered approach in the Groundwork Network. Workforce development, community stewardship, and keeping things focused on the community. We've also got a really cool GIS data collection system that is available for all of the affiliates in our network. And this allows folks to both inventory what you've got, but also track what is newly being planted and record the maintenance that is being performed on those trees as well. And something we are very excited about that is very much hot off the presses is that this also is calculating eco benefits in real time of what those exact trees are providing. So it's very specific benefits and information provided to all the affiliates in our network. So that's kind of focused on groundwork, and you'll see kind of how this fits into the kind of broader landscape of the urban forestry field as well. But I want to talk a little bit about some opportunities in this sector and also some barriers and how to overcome them. So some of the opportunities in approaching this work is really leveraging all the many different kinds of benefits of trees. I only mentioned some of them. There are so many, and some of them may not even seem as expected or that you might heard about. We know they provide clean air, but did you also kind of like realize that trees provide noise cancellation, and they can help keep your neighborhood quieter. They can help you recover faster from illnesses. If you can see a tree out a window, there's some really interesting studies about that. So depending on your audience, you can kind of leverage what kind of benefits you want to talk about and what might have the most impact. You want to talk about the economic benefits of trees or the health benefits or the neighborhood pride benefits. You can kind of lean into which direction there. It's a great opportunity in the field. Talked a little bit about this already, but there's also great opportunity in building neighborhood pride and connections. Trees are very physical, they're very tangible. You'll see it in your neighborhood and pass it, every day. It's where you live. So being a part of that process can really help get to know your neighbors and kind of build that pride in the future of your community. There's opportunity to figure out where are the gaps in this field. There's so many different angles of urban forestry. There's inventorying work. What do we have? There's the planting, there's the maintaining, there's the community outreach. So kind of figuring out on that broad scale, what's going on in my community and how can my organization or entity fit in. It's a great way to kind of get plugged in and get started. And of course, community stewardship, again, is a great opportunity. I'm a firm believer that we being, urban forestry staff or leaders, cannot manage urban forests on our own. They're literally huge. So we need everyone to step in and jump into this work, and kind of by sharing and growing those skills in the community, we can make that happen. But of course, there's the flip side of this as well. With opportunities also comes barriers to increasing our green space and to planting and maintaining trees, right? So I'll talk a little bit about some of these, and I think we've got some additional questions about that coming up later as well. But sometimes a big barrier for this work, and especially in preserving tree canopy, is that many communities have little to no, I would say most of them have no regulations about trees on private property. So there are, in some cases, really, kind of progressive and forward-thinking regulations for public trees planted maybe in the public right-of-way or in parks. But most of our urban canopy is actually located on private property. So it's people's yards, front yards, backyards. And most communities do not have regulations about how to manage or preserve those or have any rules about that. So that can be a barrier to keeping our trees, preserving our canopy. There's also a gap for maintenance of trees in general. There's a lot of attention and focus on, getting trees in the ground and planting them. It's very exciting. What is maybe less exciting is watering them and maintaining them for those first 3 years after planting. So there is a gap in that. But that's also, you can kind of think about the opportunity there of including community members in that work. And then also kind of overcoming misconceptions about trees, maybe also especially in neighborhoods that don't have as many trees and maybe don't have as much experience working with them or being around them. So I wanted to mention some of the kind of top barriers here and kind of some ways to maybe overcome them just real quick. One of the things I've heard a lot in my own work, and I know is getting heard all across the network and in other urban forestry realms as well, is that folks maybe want a smaller tree like this one up here, even though that is kind of getting very, very bushy and wide here, right? Folks say like, I don't want a big tree, but I would like a small one. This is a little bit of a barrier to this work because the bigger the tree, the more benefits it provides. Like the bigger it is, the more shade you'll get, the more it will be filtering our air, just really the more everything. So when there is room for a big tree, always encourage like go big where you can, because that tree will also live longer and really provide like literally outsized benefits when that's bigger. Another barrier we hear often and is very fair is when folks in the community say, sure, I'd love to have a tree planted, but what about that tree? And it's something maybe pictured like these ones on the top right up here where they're like, oh, I've got that dead one that needs to be replaced in the public right of way. Like, what do we do about that? Very, very real concern and barrier. And I would encourage folks in this field to kind of know ahead of time, maybe how to handle that within your municipality. Maybe that can be submitting a help ticket to your urban forestry council, or maybe it is, getting the right person at Public Works involved, but kind of knowing ahead of time before you have these conversations with community members. We also hear about damage as a barrier to getting trees planted. Folks concerned that it might do something like this, right? Land on your car, land on your house. A kind of talking point or a way to maybe combat that is that there's some risk, of course, in doing anything. There's risk in leaving the house. There's risk in getting in your car. There's definitely risk in tree planting as well, just like anything, but that the benefits do kind of outweigh those risks. And another barrier we hear is messiness. This is an Osage orange tree. I don't think y'all have them up north, but rather messy. And we can really, this one's easy to prevent and easy to combat, and that's just planting the right tree in the right place. So kind of lastly here, and then I'll kind of turn it back over for questions and conversation. What is the perfect tree for your community? Is it a microforest tree? This is a picture of that microforest Jeremy was sharing the impact status of in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and I know Groundwork Hudson Valley is planting one as well. Is it, a large tree planted on its own and mulched? Is it a fruit tree? What is the perfect tree? I'll answer this maybe a little differently, that the perfect tree is one that the community members know the benefits of and understand why it's planted there. Like community members want and that they advocated for, that there's a long kind of maintenance plan in place for. So the perfect tree is one that is cared for in the long term, right? And is the right tree kind of planted in the right place. I think we'll talk more about that here soon. I will leave it there and back over to Harrison.
That was awesome. Thank you, Meg. I mean, I think getting into the toolkit of it all is so important and how holistic all that is. So thank you for bringing that up. Before we switch it over to questions, or perhaps as sort of a warm up to lovely listener questions, we're gonna have another poll. So what do you think would make the biggest difference in growing the tree canopy where you live or in your community? Is it prioritizing underserved neighborhoods, increasing funding, addressing regulatory challenges, which Meg had brought up, or maybe enhancing public-private partnerships, thinking about the right-of-way or street trees, and how do you take the burden off of cities to fully maintain those themselves. Cool. Couple more seconds, but it seems pretty even, which I think is right, and I think is kind of reflective of the conversation that we were having, which it requires a mosaic approach. There's no right one way to do any of this, just as Jeremy had said about tree canopy and cool roofs. You sort of need a little bit of everything, and I think that that's a very encouraging note, right? That anything that you do is going to make a positive difference. So don't think about it as if it's a hierarchy. So we're going to wrap. This was very tight, but it seems like enhancing public-private partnerships with 36%. That's what most people voted for. So that's all really interesting. So I want to open it up to questions from the audience. I want to start with Chanel asked a really great question earlier on, which they remarked that it was really interesting to hear about the difference between cool roofs and regular roofs. Chanel, I'm wondering if you want to ask your question and get you off mic. We're having technical difficulties. I can also read it. Chanel asked, what caliber of tree is used for the NASA develop model? So Jeremy, I think this one's for you.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. I don't have the technical notes like exactly handy, but from the perspective of the illustration, it would appear at least like 3 to 5, a fairly mature young tree, if that makes sense. But definitely, there are limitations to the transplantability as you get older. So most of the time, trees that are planted in our, at least some of the largest trees that are planted in our network now are in New Orleans. And I forget, Meg, if you can think of what Todd tends to plant now. He did some really extremely large trees. But most of the time, if they're street tree plantings, they're going to be only a few years old.
Yeah, and for folks who might not know too, tree caliper refers to the size of the tree and to how many inches that trunk is. So most affiliates in the network are planting trees that are about 1 inch caliper, but some of them go even as big as 5 inches, which makes a really big difference in that overall size of the tree. And of course, you'll plant smaller trees for that microforest, as Jeremy was mentioning.
I'm also curious to know, y'all talked about doing a lot of different ways to think about how to address extreme heat, which we're all aware of. And Jeremy, you had brought up that really illustrative slide showing that some areas of Yonkers are 15 degrees warmer on some days than others. How do you calculate heat? We know that heat impacts everyone differently. So what constitutes a heat wave, and how can folks make sure that they're staying safe on those hot days?
Yeah, so a definition of a heat wave is actually something that is really region and place dependent. So you can imagine someone living and growing up in Miami or Corpus Christi, Texas, or Phoenix, Arizona, is going to be much more physiologically accustomed and what we would call like acclimatized to extreme heat. So there, the National Weather Service has very specific and much higher thresholds for what is considered high heat risk days versus a place like Bangor, Maine, or Minneapolis, Minnesota, or Seattle, Washington. Those places are going to have very much lower thresholds for what constitutes extreme heat, simply because they're more northern cities that haven't historically dealt with the kinds of extreme heat that places in the Southwest or in the American Southeast are as well. So they're very regionally dependent. And so I would encourage anyone here that is interested in that to look up your local National Weather Service office. And they are the ones that will be issuing extreme heat risk kinds of warnings in the summer. But we also know that based on these results, like you said, Harrison, is that even on a heat risk day, which that's what that was in August of 2019, some places within a city will fall below that threshold. So they might not be necessarily experiencing the conditions of an extreme heat wave, while other parts of the same city, which are many degrees warmer because of the built environment around them, they're actually experiencing a much more severe heat risk day. So that's really what's important about these sorts of data sets that we collect with community members, is that we can gain this really high resolution understanding of how that risk would vary given a National Weather Service kind of warning. So when that happens, we tend to open, city governance structures tend to open cooling centers, which offer places of, HVAC, air conditioning. They tend to also have cool water available for drinking. But really getting the most important thing about extreme heat days is to recognize the sorts of warning signs of extreme heat illness and heat stroke. So the National Weather Service actually puts out very good imagery around what to know about someone that is potentially experiencing an extreme heat illness. Now, we tend to also think about the subpopulations of our community who might be more disproportionately inclined or affected by extreme heat. That would be very much more elderly residents, people with severe respiratory issues, very young children, and then people that as part of their day-to-day lives are more exposed to extreme heat through being outside. So this is people that might be working in construction. This is people working in very hot workplaces like industrial workplaces, restaurants, and then people that disproportionately rely on public transportation to get around. As we know, in some of our own studies in Richmond, Virginia, where I live, many of our public transit infrastructure is inadequate to protect people from the elements, both extreme heat and things like extreme cold. So, providing shade at places where people congregate to use public transportation is one of the primary ways that we can kind of keep people that have to be outside for one reason or another safer in those sorts of situations. Then also one last thing would be just being able to get yourself cooled down by having access to cool water. So the military, believe it or not, has some of the best understanding of how to keep people safe. And so by putting cold water on places like your wrists and in your ears, places where your blood is circulating in a very thin membrane of your skin, is a good way to do that. So if you are outside this summer and it's 98 degrees outside, just even taking a bit of, I know this sounds gross, but I'm a sweater. I sweat just so much. And I'll even just wipe my own brows and put it into my ears, and you can feel the difference in that kind of comfort level. So there are a lot of different ways to keep yourself safe. Cool water is the primary way, and just be aware of the kinds of warning signs of people experiencing heat-related illnesses like heat stroke and heat exhaustion. That's one way that we can be sure that we can keep our neighbors safe in heat extreme.
Thank you, Jeremy. A couple other great questions. Let's do a lightning round. Marisha, good to see you. Do you want to ask your question, or would you like me to read it for you?
I like to ask my question. So during to like Midwest or right now the whole country is going through a weatherization where I don't understand. So how does that affect the tree when it's less heat, more rain, less rain, cold, hot? How does that affect the growth of the tree? And then is it a time where the ground is too hot up underneath for it to grow, or that doesn't measure anything?
Yeah, great question, Marisha. Thanks for asking this. So trees have it rough out there, right? It is tough environments, and especially it's growing to become even tougher out there, with some places expected to receive and already receiving more extreme rainfall due to the effects of climate change. Some areas are hotter, some are colder, some are all of the above, right? So how do we plan for the perfect tree for our city, given all of the situation, whether you're in the Midwest, kind of in your area or otherwise? hardy trees are the way to go. We have talked a little bit about, making sure trees are cared for and getting the right tree in the right place, but kind of more and more, you want to look for hardy species, and in most situations that also means a native species, because they are kind of naturally hardier and used to their environment where they're used to growing. So I would say looking for, when you're planning and doing that design, making sure that it is a pretty tough species. There are many great native species in most communities that are both native but also drought tolerant and flood tolerant and salt tolerant, especially up north, kind of towards Yonkers. You want to be thinking about that too. And then the location of the tree is another thing to keep in mind. Street trees kind of have it the toughest of all, even though they do also provide kind of outsized benefits because of kind of stormwater mitigation in particular, and they're just high traffic areas, so people can really experience those benefits. But in those areas in particular is where you really want to plant like the hardiest, toughest you got, who are tolerant of all those different situations. I hope that answers your question, Marisha.
Thanks, Meg. I want to send it over. We have a couple microforest questions, which I think sort of ties into where you finished, Meg. But Helen, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Harrison. And Meg said she could probably answer this, but maybe Jeremy too. I've read that microforests are a bit controversial in that you plant a lot more trees than survive, and that survival rate is kind of like an expensive piece of planting. And I'm not sure about maintenance. I think the thing is you plant a microforest and walk away. Do you have to maintain them? So 2 questions, I guess.
I'm going to jump in if that's all right first, Meg. But I just want to give a quick shout out. We'll say that at the end. But Groundwork Hudson Valley is going to be planting a microforest at the Barack Obama School for Social Justice this spring, and invite you all to join us. And for those who aren't familiar, a microforest, or some in the UK they might be called a tiny forest, it's a very dense planting of native species in the area of like a few parking spots. You might see some upwards of a few hundred trees planted. So what Helen said is exactly right. It's something called the Miyawaki method, named after this very visionary Japanese botanist. And essentially what you do is by planting trees so closely together, there's a competition for growth. All the trees are trying to shoot upwards to gather as much sun as they can. So inevitably what happens is you get, through this competition, a lot of trees do die. So you're starting to see something where some microforests, like the one that we're planting, are actually planting fewer canopy trees and more shade tolerant trees, so that hopefully in 10 years, when we're reaping all of those benefits, because part of the sell of a microforest is within 10 years, your forest may look as if it's 100 years old, rather than just having a few surviving hardy Stallone, Schwarzenegger type trees, which are fun, but you need a full cast. So we are hoping that in 10 years, we'll have a lot of understory trees that'll be more reflective of a more holistic forest, and not just a few standing oaks. But Megan, Jeremy, I'm curious if you have anything to add.
Beautifully put, Harrison. Yes. And I love this question, Helen, because it's actually the idea. It's actually like one of the major points and benefits of microforests is that you want a lot of those trees to not make it to that full maturity and survival, because that is kind of promoting this competition and really fast growth. So on your question of both like funding that and like the kind of cost benefit of putting so many trees in if they're not all going to make it, versus the maintenance piece of that as well. There is a lot of benefit to planting those smaller trees in these microforests too, right? So those are a lot cheaper than those bigger trees. You can also plant different kinds of stock many times. Many times folks will plant bare root stock trees in microforests, which can be a little bit challenging logistics wise, because you really have to keep those roots wet and submerged kind of until planting, but they're like much more cost effective if you can make that happen. So yes, you do have that kind of like initial investment, and then it feels like you're losing it because a lot of those trees die. You can almost think of that as a kind of investment into those trees that will grow really fast and that will make it and get huge much faster than they would planted in a different environment. And then maintenance, real quickly, light maintenance, at least the first year or so. And then after that, then it's really just kind of checking on them, and in a drought situation, watering. But other than that, it is this kind of self-sustaining system that you don't have to maintain a lot. So that's another kind of benefit of microforests.
Unfortunately, we're gonna have to close up. Norma does ask a great question. If there's data comparing the mortality rate of trees in microforest to street trees. Meg, Jeremy, are you aware in 30 seconds? Then I'll close up. If not, and then I see Marisha too, but we're gonna have our emails at the end. So please feel free to keep asking questions. This is unfortunately just what we wanted. So maybe we should open up our last slide. Norma, we're gonna get back to you on that. Same with you, Marisha. I want to thank everyone for joining. Again, this has been, I found it really fun. I hope you have as well. Some closing thoughts I have. Perfect tree is right tree, right place, and it's how you maintain it. Meg, Jeremy, I'm curious if you have any kind of closing thoughts in 20 seconds.
Maybe also swamp white oak. Throwing that out there. Hardy native species, can handle everything, gets nice and big. If I had to say one, I would say that.
I just wanted to say that the street tree survival rates are huge range. There's a huge range, and so there's not a very good range yet of microforest information. But the Elizabeth, New Jersey mortality rate is very low in relation to the range of mortality for street trees. It all goes back to maintenance. We got to invest in the maintenance.
And for all listeners, Jeremy and I are going to be speaking on Friday about what data to collect from our microforest. So if any of you want to email me with questions that you are interested in us gathering, please let us know. So Norma, mortality rates is certainly one. We're also going to be looking at carbon sequestration and stormwater capture. But if you have ideas, we'd love to hear from you. All right, shall we put up the final? Design and plant with maintenance in mind. Yes, I echo that, Chanel. Thank you for mentioning that. Maintenance, maintenance, maintenance. So on the maintenance note, if you're interested in continuing to participate or want to learn how to plant trees or just hear more about it, please join one of our working groups. We're recruiting right now for our shade structure working group, which is looking at building shade structures to mitigate or reduce, provide cooling benefits to folks during extreme heat events. So on streets that don't have a lot of street trees and maybe can't accommodate street trees, we're going to build shade structures around them, giving folks a chance to rest. But we also are recruiting for our tree canopy working group. So if you're interested in inventorying trees, planting trees, maintaining trees, get in touch. These are all paid working groups. And we're also recruiting for an air quality working group. And as I mentioned, we are planting a microforest on Thursday, April 24th at the Barack Obama School for Social Justice. I think that there's some information right now in the chat, so just reach out to us if you're interested in joining any of these groups or speaking with us if you have questions. But I really want to thank everyone for joining us today. And a quick reminder that this is one of the first of 3 webinars we're going to be doing. The next one will focus on trees and air quality. So if you're interested in that, please join us again. I want to thank our wonderful presenters, Meg Morgan and Jeremy Hoffman, and Candida and Jerome behind the booth. And most of all, you. Thank you for joining. Make it all worth it. And Christina behind the booth. Oh my gosh, Christina. What could we do without Christina? Okay. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.